Hey guys, tonight, our stories are about the masks that people wear, the carefully constructed facades of normalcy that can conceal a darkness so profound it defies comprehension. We'll begin with the story of a man who was, by all accounts, a pillar of his community. He was a husband and a father, a Boy Scout leader, a compliance officer for his local township, and the elected president of his church council. He was a man you would see at the grocery store, a familiar, unassuming face in a quiet Midwestern city. But this man lived a secret life. For 30 years, he was a phantom who terrorized his community, a sadistic serial killer who gave himself a chilling moniker, a name that described his brutal, ritualistic work. BTK, for bind, torture, kill. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to think about the people you see every day, the neighbors and coworkers who make up the familiar landscape of your life. Think about the friendly faces, the routine interactions, and the profound, unspoken trust that underlies it all. Now, imagine one of those faces being a mask, a perfect disguise for a monster. It's a comfort to know we can explore these dark chapters together. A quiet community gathering from all corners of the globe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's travel to the quiet heartland of America, to Wichita, Kansas, and the beginning of a 30-year nightmare. The BTK killer, Wichita, Kansas, in the winter of 1974, was the picture of wholesome heartland America. It was a city of sprawling suburbs, family-friendly parks, and a strong community-oriented culture rooted in church and traditional values. It was the kind of place that felt insulated from the violent, chaotic social changes that seemed to be roiling the nation's coasts. It was a safe place, a place to raise a family. But on the cold, clear morning of January 15th, that deeply held sense of security would be shattered by a crime so brutal and so incomprehensible that it would leave a permanent scar on the city's soul. The crime unfolded in a small, neat house in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. The home belonged to the Otero family. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with their two youngest children, 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine, had been brutally murdered. The discovery was made by the family's 3 older children when they returned home from school that afternoon. They walked into a scene of silent, unimaginable horror. Their parents and their younger siblings had been bound with rope and then killed with a horrifying ritualistic violence. The West Wichita police were stunned. This was not a typical crime. The motive was not robbery. While a small amount of money and a radio were missing, it seemed like an afterthought. This was something else, something personal and deeply sadistic. The killer had spent a significant amount of time in the house with his victims. The bindings were intricate, and the nature of the murders spoke to a dark, psychological compulsion. The police were baffled. They had no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear motive. They were hunting a ghost who had committed an act of almost unbelievable cruelty and then vanished without a trace. The city of Wichita was plunged into a state of fear. A crime of this nature was an alien presence in their quiet world. But as the weeks turned into months with no new leads, the fear began to subside, replaced by the uneasy quiet of an unsolved mystery. The Otero family massacre remained a dark, isolated chapter in the city's history. Then, 3 months later, the phantom struck again. On the morning of April 4th, 1974, a 21-year-old woman named Catherine Bright returned to her home with her younger brother, Kevin. As they entered the house, a man emerged from a back room, holding a pistol. He was calm and authoritative. He ordered them into the bedroom and, using rope, tied them up. He began to question Kevin, asking if he had money, if he had a car. Then his demeanor shifted. He began to strangle Catherine. Kevin, in a desperate bid to save his sister, managed to partially free himself and began to struggle with the attacker. The attacker shot him twice, once in the head. Believing Kevin was dead, the man then turned his full attention back to Catherine, stabbing her multiple times. The killer then fled the scene. Miraculously, Kevin Bright survived. The shot to his head had not been fatal. He managed to stumble out of the house and get help. His sister, Catherine, tragically, did not survive her injuries, but the killer had made a critical mistake. He had left behind a survivor who could describe him. Kevin described the attacker as a man of average height, with a psychotic look in his eyes. More importantly, he had gotten a good look at the man's face. A composite sketch was created, but it was generic, a face that could belong to 1,000 different men. The police now had a description, but they were no closer to finding their man. The connection to the Otero murders, while suspected, was not definitive. The city was now dealing with two horrifying, unsolved crimes. For the next few months, the killer remained silent. The city was on edge, but with no new attacks, a tense quiet returned. The killer, it seemed, was not happy with this. He craved recognition. He wanted the world to know that these were not random, isolated acts of violence, but the work of a single, brilliant predator. In October of 1974, he decided to introduce himself. He wrote a letter and tucked it into an engineering textbook in the Wichita Public Library. The letter was found by a local journalist. In it, the writer took credit for the Otero family murders, providing details that only the killer could have known. He described the crime in a cold, detached tone, reveling in his power over his victims. The letter was filled with a sense of aggrieved narcissism. The writer was angry that his crimes had not received the national attention he felt they deserved. He wrote, "It's a monster story, and I am the monster. Society can be thankful that I'm not out there killing every day." He then did something that would define his entire criminal legacy. He gave himself a name. He wrote, "I have a name for myself. Call it the BTK Strangler." He went on to explain the chilling acronym. Bind them, torture them, kill them. BTK, you see, it's me. He had created his own brand, his own monstrous persona. The ghost now had a name, and that name was a declaration of his methods. The police and the public were horrified. The letter confirmed their worst fears. A single, intelligent, and sadistic serial killer was operating in their city, and he was just getting started. Over the next 3 years, BTK would strike again and again, each crime following his brutal, ritualistic pattern. In March of 1977, he killed Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother, in her own home. He locked her 3 young children in the bathroom while he murdered her. In December of 1977, he killed 25-year-old Nancy Fox. After her murder, he did something even more brazen. He called the police from a payphone and, in a cold, flat voice, reported the crime himself. "You will find a homicide at 843 South Pershing," he said, and then hung up. The city of Wichita was living in a state of siege. The killer seemed to be able to strike anywhere, to enter any home. He was a phantom who could be anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, a friendly face in a crowd. The police investigation, led by Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, was one of the largest in Kansas history. But they were getting nowhere. They had letters, they had a name, but they had no suspect. And then, after the murder of Nancy Fox in 1977, the killings stopped. The letters stopped. The phone calls stopped. BTK, the man who had terrorized a city for 3 years, simply vanished. The case went cold. But the fear he had created did not. For the next quarter of a century, the city of Wichita would live with the ghost of BTK, a silent, ever-present bogeyman who had gotten away with it. The families of his victims were left without justice, and the community was left with a chilling, unanswered question. Where had the monster gone? Was he dead? Was he in prison for some other crime? Or was he still there, living among them, a husband, a father, a neighbor, patiently waiting for the right moment to re-emerge from the shadows? For 27 long years, the city of Wichita lived with the ghost of the BTK killer. The case became one of America's most famous and frustrating cold cases, a dark piece of local folklore that parents would use to scare their children. The files remained open, but the leads had long since dried up. The original detectives who had worked the case grew old and retired, passing the heavy, unsolved burden on to a new generation. The families of the victims were left in a state of perpetual, agonizing limbo. their grief compounded by the lack of justice and the knowledge that the man who had destroyed their lives was likely still out there, a phantom walking among them. The question of what had happened to BTK was a source of endless speculation. Had he died? Had he been imprisoned for another crime? Or had he simply, for reasons unknown, decided to stop killing? The latter possibility was, in some ways, the most terrifying. It suggested a level of self-control that was almost inhuman, a monster who could turn his violent compulsions on and off like a switch. The truth was that BTK was very much alive, and he was indeed living among them. His name was Dennis Rader, and while the city of Wichita was haunted by the memory of his crimes, he was living a life of almost parodic, mundane normalcy in the nearby suburb of Park City. He was a husband and the father of 2 children. He was a longtime employee of the security company ADT. He was a Boy Scout leader. He was the elected president of his local Lutheran church council. He was, by all outward appearances, a pillar of the community, a respectable, law-abiding, and utterly unremarkable family man. He was a monster hidden in the most perfect camouflage imaginable. A life of boring, suburban routine. During his long period of dormancy, Rader's dark, narcissistic fantasies did not disappear. They simply went underground. He was a meticulous and obsessive record-keeper of his own crimes. He kept a hidden collection of trophies taken from his victims: driver's licenses, jewelry, personal items. He wrote detailed, self-aggrandizing accounts of his murders in a series of secret journals, and he engaged in a private, ritualistic world of autoerotic fantasy, dressing up in the masks and clothing of his victims, reliving the thrill of his crimes in the quiet solitude of his own home. He was a predator in hibernation, his ego and his compulsions simmering just beneath the surface of his placid, everyday life. For over 2 decades, he managed to keep this dark world a complete secret. But by the early 2000s, something began to stir within him. The man who had once craved and commanded the media spotlight could no longer stand to be forgotten. He saw his legacy, the legend of the great BTK killer, beginning to fade. A local newspaper was planning to run a retrospective article on the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. A book was being written about his crimes. Dennis Rader, the narcissist, could not stand the idea of other people telling his story. He decided it was time for BTK to come out of retirement. In March of 2004, 30 years after the Otero murders, a letter arrived at the offices of the Wichita Eagle. The letter contained a photocopy of the driver's license of Vicki Wegerle, a woman who had been murdered in her home in 1986, a crime that had, until that moment, never been officially linked to BTK. The letter also contained 3 photographs of her body, pictures that had been taken by the killer himself at the scene of the crime. The message was clear and chilling. "I'm back," BTK was saying, "and don't you forget about me." The envelope was signed with his signature symbol. The ghost had returned. The arrival of the letter sent a new wave of terror through Wichita and reignited one of the nation's most famous cold cases. A new task force was formed, led by the same determined homicide lieutenant, Ken Landwehr, who had been a young detective during the original BTK crime spree. They now had a direct line of communication with the killer, and they began a strange and high-stakes game of cat and mouse, a public conversation with a ghost who had been silent for a generation. BTK, his ego now fully re-engaged, began a prolific and bizarre correspondence with the local media and the police. He sent a series of packages and letters, each one a new chapter in his twisted psychodrama. He sent puzzles, word searches, and crude, almost childlike, drawings. He sent a detailed, 3-page table of contents for the book he was writing about his life, which he titled The BTK Story. He was reveling in the renewed attention, playing a game with the very people who were trying to hunt him down. He would leave his packages in bizarre, public places, taped to a stop sign, left in a public park, tucked inside a cereal box that he would then place in the back of a pickup truck in a Home Depot parking lot. Each package was a new clue, a new piece of his psychological puzzle. In one package, he included a doll that was dressed to look like one of his victims, bound in the same way. In another, he sent a chain of jewelry that was later identified as belonging to his final known victim from the 1970s. Nancy Fox. The police played along with his game, using the media to communicate back to him. They knew that his immense ego, his desperate need for recognition, was his greatest weakness. They appealed to it, asking him questions in their press conferences, treating him as the criminal mastermind he so clearly believed himself to be. They were trying to lull him into a state of overconfidence, hoping that in his desire to show off, to prove how clever he would make a mistake. For nearly a year, this strange, long-distance dance continued. BTK remained a phantom, his identity a complete mystery. The DNA evidence he had left behind at one of his crime scenes had been run through every criminal database in the country. But there were no matches. He was a man with no prior record of violent crime, a ghost in the system. The police had his DNA, his letters, his persona, but they were no closer to knowing his name. But in early 2005, the 30-year-old mystery would finally be unraveled, not by a brilliant piece of detective work or a lucky break, but by the killer's own hubris and his fatal misunderstanding of a simple piece of technology. In one of his letters, he asked the police a direct question, a question born of his desire to share even more of his story. He wanted to know if he could send them his writings on a floppy disk, and if they would be able to trace it back to him. The police, seeing their chance, responded publicly in a classified ad in the newspaper, as he had instructed. Their answer was a simple, calculated lie. "Rex," they wrote, using a code name he had suggested. "It will be okay." They told him that a floppy disk was untraceable. It was a trap, and BTK, the man who had outsmarted the police for 3 decades, was about to walk right into it. The police's calculated deception was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. They had played directly to the killer's vanity, to his desperate need to control his own narrative. BTK, believing the police's assurance that a floppy disk could not be traced, decided to trust them. On February 16, 2005, he sent his next package to a local television station, KSAS-TV. Inside was a single purple 1.44 megabyte Memorex floppy disk. It was the mistake the police had been waiting for 30 years. The disk was immediately rushed to a forensic computer lab. The investigators, their hearts pounding with anticipation, inserted it into a computer. On the disk, they found a deleted Word document which they were easily able to recover. It was a chapter from his proposed book, another rambling, self-aggrandizing piece of writing. But the document itself was not the prize. The real clue was hidden in the document's metadata, the invisible digital footprint that every computer file carries with it. Embedded in the metadata of the deleted Word document, they found 2 crucial pieces of information. The first was the name of the last person to have modified the document, Dennis. The second was the name of the organization where the computer was registered, Christ Lutheran Church. The detectives on the task force could hardly believe their luck. After 3 decades of chasing a phantom, they now had a first name and a specific physical location. A quick search of the church's records revealed that the president of the church council, the man who had access to the church's computer, was a man named Dennis Rader. The name was a shock. Dennis Rader was not some shadowy drifter or a known criminal. He was a 60-year-old, married father of 2. He was a compliance officer for Park City, a neighboring suburb. He was a Boy Scout leader. He was the president of his church. He was a pillar of the community, a man who, on the surface, was the very picture of mundane Middle American respectability. Could this unassuming, rule-following bureaucrat truly be the sadistic, taunting monster who had terrorized the city for a generation? The police moved quickly but cautiously. They needed a definitive link, something that would tie Dennis Rader directly to the crimes. They needed his DNA, but they couldn't simply ask him for a sample. That would tip him off and risk him destroying evidence or fleeing. They needed to obtain it covertly. Their opportunity came through a stroke of luck. They learned that Rader's daughter, Carrie, was a student at a university in another state and that she had recently had a pap smear done at the university's medical clinic. The police obtained a warrant for that medical sample. The sample was rushed to the lab and compared to the semen evidence that had been collected from the 1986 Vicky Wegerle crime scene. The lab technicians ran a familial DNA comparison, a technique that can determine a close biological relationship. The result was a definitive match. The DNA from the crime scene belonged to a close male relative of the woman whose medical sample they had tested. The chain of evidence was now complete. Dennis Rader, the church president, the Boy Scout leader, the family man, was the BTK killer. On the morning of February 25, 2005, the trap was set. Police surveillance units followed Dennis Rader as he left his home and began his drive to work. They waited for him to be in a safe, open location, away from his home and any potential weapons. As he drove down a suburban street, a fleet of unmarked police cars swarmed his vehicle. Blocking him in, Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, the man who had hunted him for decades, walked up to the driver's side window. "Mr. Rader," he said, "I need to talk to you about the BTK case." Rader was initially calm, almost cocky, but as he was taken to the police station and the interrogation began, the weight of the evidence against him became overwhelming. The detectives presented him with the metadata from the floppy disk, the DNA match, and the other pieces of evidence they had gathered. For hours, Rader denied everything, but as the interrogation wore on, his facade began to crumble. Lieutenant Landwehr, in a final, brilliant piece of psychological maneuvering, appealed to Rader's ego one last time. He told him that he knew Rader was a man of honor, a man who had served his country, a man who kept his word. He asked him if he would give his word of honor that he was not the BTK killer. And in that moment, the monster who had hidden for 30 years finally emerged. Dennis Rader's composure broke. "I need to know," he asked, "if my family will be protected." With that single question, the 30-year reign of terror was over. The interrogation that followed was one of the most chilling in the history of criminal investigation. For over 30 hours, Dennis Rader, in a flat, emotionless, and deeply narcissistic tone, recounted the details of his secret life. He confessed to all 10 of the BTK murders, describing each crime with a horrifying bureaucratic detachment, as if he were recounting a routine day at the office. He spoke of his victims not as human beings, but as projects. He described his methods, his fantasies, and the dark internal factor that had driven him to kill. It was a glimpse into a mind that was profoundly, terrifyingly empty of empathy. A mind that had successfully compartmentalized a life of unimaginable evil within a shell of perfect, banal normalcy. The news of his arrest sent a wave of shock and disbelief through the city of Wichita and, indeed, the entire country. The monster who had haunted their nightmares for a generation was not a shadowy phantom. He was the man next door, the man who cited them for overgrown lawns, the man who passed the collection plate at church on Sunday. His own family, his wife and 2 children, were completely blindsided. They had had no idea that the man they shared their lives with was one of the nation's most prolific and sadistic serial killers. The perfect mask that Dennis Rader had worn for 60 years had finally, irrevocably, been torn away, revealing the terrifying, ordinary face of evil that had been hiding behind it all along. The trial of Dennis Rader, which took place in the summer of 2005, was a formality. He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder, sparing the families of his victims the ordeal of a long and painful trial. But his sentencing hearing became a final, horrifying piece of public theater. The courtroom was packed with the family members of his victims, who, for the first time, were given the opportunity to confront the man who had destroyed their lives. One by one, they stood and delivered powerful, emotional victim impact statements, their voices filled with decades of grief, anger, and loss. Rader, for his part, sat through their testimony with a chilling, almost bored detachment. When it was his turn to speak, he delivered a long, rambling, and deeply narcissistic monologue. He spoke of his crimes in a cold, clinical tone, offering a bizarre, academic-sounding analysis of his own dark factors and projects. He showed no remorse, no empathy, no understanding of the immense human suffering he had caused. His statement was the final public performance of a man who saw his own life as a great, dark work of art, and his victims as nothing more than props in his personal drama. At the end of the hearing, the judge sentenced him to 10 consecutive life sentences, the maximum possible under Kansas law at the time of the murders. ensuring that he would die in prison. The legacy of the BTK case is a profound and unsettling one. It is a story that fundamentally challenged our understanding of what a serial killer is supposed to be. Dennis Rader was not a social outcast or a transient drifter. He was a deeply integrated and in many ways successful member of his community. He was a man who was able to maintain a perfect, convincing mask of normalcy for over 3 decades, while simultaneously living a secret life of sadistic, ritualistic violence. His case is a terrifying testament to the human capacity for compartmentalization, and a chilling reminder that the most monstrous evil can hide behind the most ordinary and unassuming of faces. The story also marked a pivotal moment in the history of criminal investigation. It was one of the first major cold cases to be solved through the use of digital forensics. The metadata on the floppy disk, a piece of technology that was already becoming obsolete, was the single crucial clue that finally brought him down. It was a perfect, ironic end for a killer who had been so media-savvy in the 1970s, but had failed to understand the new, invisible fingerprints of the digital age. His own ego, his desperate need to communicate and control his own story, was his ultimate undoing. For the city of Wichita, the capture of Dennis Rader brought a sense of profound relief and a long-delayed closure. The ghost that had haunted the city for a generation finally had a face, and that face was shockingly, terrifyingly ordinary. The case forced the community to confront an uncomfortable truth. The monster was not an outsider who had come to prey upon them. He was one of them. He had been there all along, hiding in plain sight. For the families of his victims, the Oteros, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerle, and Dolores Davis, the resolution was a more complex and bittersweet one. They finally had justice for their loved ones, but it came after decades of living with the pain of the unknown, and the knowledge that the killer had been living a happy, normal family life while their own families had been shattered by his actions was a particularly cruel and difficult truth to bear. Dennis Rader continues to serve his life sentences at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He remains a subject of intense fascination for criminologists and psychologists, a living case study in the mind of a narcissistic sociopath. From his prison cell, he has continued to communicate, corresponding with journalists and authors, still trying to control the narrative of his life and crimes. The BTK case is a dark and enduring chapter in the annals of American crime. It is a story about the terror of randomness, the resilience of a community, and the patient, decades-long work of law enforcement. But most of all, it is a cautionary tale about the masks we wear. It reminds us that we can never truly know the secrets that lie hidden in the hearts of those around us, and that the quiet, unassuming neighbor next door can sometimes be the very monster we fear the most. The story of the BTK killer was a 30-year mystery, a ghost who hid in plain sight until his own ego led to his downfall. But some crimes are not about a single, hidden predator. They are about a vast international conspiracy, where the weapon is not a rope or a knife, but a single, silent, deadly drop of poison, and the victim is a man who knew too much. The disappearance of Michael Rockefeller, the world of Michael Clark Rockefeller, was one of immense privilege, a landscape defined by soaring Manhattan skyscrapers, sprawling family estates, and the quiet, marble-lined halls of political power. Born in 1938, he was the youngest son of Nelson Rockefeller, then governor of New York and future vice president of the United States, and the great-grandson of John D. Rockefeller, the titan of industry who had founded a dynasty. Michael's path seemed preordained: an Ivy League education, followed by a comfortable, influential position in the family's vast network of business or philanthropic ventures. He was intelligent, handsome, and thoughtful, poised to inherit a world of limitless possibility. But the world Michael sought was half a planet away, a place of mangrove swamps, malarial heat, and ancient cultures living in near-total isolation from the 20th century. This was the Asmat region, a wild, untamed expanse on the southwestern coast of what was then Dutch New Guinea. After graduating with honors from Harvard, Michael had served a brief stint in the army and found himself restless, unfulfilled by the gilded cage of his birthright. He was drawn not to boardrooms, but to the raw, expressive power of what was then called primitive art. In 1961, He joined an expedition from Harvard's Peabody Museum to study the Dani people in the New Guinea highlands, but it was the art of the coastal Asmat people that truly captured his soul. The Asmat were a semi-nomadic people, living in one of the most remote and challenging environments on Earth. Their lives were dictated by the rhythm of the tides, the dense jungle, and a complex, often violent spiritual cosmology. They were known for their staggering artistic creations, intricately carved shields, ceremonial drums, and most famously, towering bisht poles, ancestor poles carved from single mangrove trees to appease the spirits of the dead, particularly those who had been victims of headhunting raids. For the Asmat, art and life were inextricably linked to ritual, spirituality, and warfare. Headhunting was not merely an act of aggression. It was a fundamental social and religious obligation, a way to balance the cosmic scales and transfer the life force of an enemy to one's own community. Michael was not a plunderer. He was a genuine student. He learned the local language, bartered respectfully for artifacts with steel axes and tobacco, and kept meticulous notes and photographs. He was fascinated by the authenticity of the Asmat, by a culture where art was not a commodity but a vital conduit to the spirit world. He saw a profound beauty in their work that he felt was missing from his own Western culture. It's the desire to do something adventurous, he wrote in a letter home. At a time when the world is losing its mystery, he decided to mount his own, more focused expedition, determined to collect the finest examples of Asmat art for a new wing at his father's Museum of Primitive Art in New York. He believed he was preserving a culture that was on the brink of irreversible change. In the autumn of 1961, he returned to the Asmat coast, accompanied by a Dutch anthropologist named René Wassing. Their plan was to travel by water, navigating the treacherous estuaries and rivers to reach villages that rarely, if ever, saw outsiders. They commissioned the construction of a makeshift vessel, 2 dugout canoes lashed together with a wooden platform and powered by a single outboard motor. It was a clumsy, top-heavy craft, ill-suited for the unpredictable waters of the Arafura Sea, which separated the Asmat coast from the open ocean. On November 18, 1961, Michael and Wassing set out from the coastal administrative post of Agates. With them were 2 local teenage guides, Leo and Simon. Their goal was to travel south along the coast to a particularly isolated region, hoping to acquire a major bisht pole. They loaded the catamaran with their supplies, trading goods, camera equipment, food, and fuel. The craft sat low in the water, already dangerously overloaded. As they chugged away from Agates, the sea was deceptively calm. But as they neared the wide, powerful mouth of the Islandin River, the weather turned. The tide shifted, and the outgoing river current clashed violently with the incoming ocean swell, creating a chaotic churn of choppy, unpredictable waves. The small outboard motor strained against the powerful forces. A wave crashed over the side, swamping the engine and killing it instantly. They were adrift, tossed about at the mercy of the current. For hours they floated, trying desperately to restart the motor, bailing water, and watching the hazy green line of the shore grow more distant. Night fell, and with it, a cold, profound darkness. They were alone in a vast, indifferent wilderness. The next morning, November 19th, the situation was dire. The catamaran had drifted even further from shore, an estimated 12 miles out to sea. The sun beat down on them relentlessly. Their fresh water was gone. They saw a plane in the distance and tried to signal it, but it passed without noticing them. Hope began to curdle into despair. Michael, ever the pragmatist, began to calculate their chances. The 2 local guides, Leo and Simon, were strong swimmers and knew the currents. After a brief discussion, they decided to make a swim for shore to get help. They stripped down, tied empty fuel cans to their bodies for buoyancy, and slipped into the water, quickly disappearing into the vast expanse of the sea. Michael and René Wassing were now alone on the crippled vessel. They clung to the wreckage, the hours dragging on. The heat was oppressive, their thirst agonizing. At around 8 a.m., another wave, larger than the others, struck the catamaran. With a groan of splintering wood, the vessel overturned completely, plunging them both into the water. They managed to cling to the capsized hulls, their situation now beyond desperate. They were floating on a piece of debris in a sea known for sharks and saltwater crocodiles, with the shore a seemingly impossible distance away. Wassing, older and less physically fit, was resigned to waiting for a rescue that might never come. But Michael, at 23, was strong, fit, and possessed an iron will. He looked at the distant, shimmering line of the coast. He could see the mangroves, a smudge of dark green against the pale blue sky. He believed he could make it. He began to strip down to his underwear, preparing for the swim of his life. He gathered 2 empty gasoline cans, intending to strap them to his back for flotation, just as the guides had done. Wassing pleaded with him not to go. "It's too far," he argued. The currents were treacherous. The shore was further than it looked, and the dangers lurking in the water were very real. But Michael's mind was made up. Waiting felt like a passive surrender to fate, and that was not in his nature. He looked at Wassing, his face determined. "I think I can make it," he said. Those were the last words Rene Wassing would ever hear him speak. He strapped the jerrycans to his body, slipped off the overturned hull, and began to swim, a small, solitary figure moving with a steady, powerful stroke toward the distant, silent shore. Wassing watched until Michael was just a tiny, receding, eventually vanishing from sight into the immense, shimmering emptiness of the Arafura Sea. For Rene Wassing, the hours that followed Michael's departure were a slow, agonizing descent into a crucible of heat and fear. He clung to the slick, overturned hull of the catamaran, a tiny speck of human desperation in a vast, indifferent sea. The sun was a relentless hammer, blistering his skin and inflaming a thirst that became an all-consuming torment. The world shrank to the rhythmic slosh of water, the sting of salt in his eyes, and the terrifying expanse of the horizon, which offered no comfort, no sign of hope. He scanned the water not for Michael. He knew he would not see him again, but for the fin of a shark or the long, silent shadow of a crocodile. Each passing hour felt like a lifetime, each wave that rocked the wreckage a fresh assault on his dwindling resolve. The next day, what felt like an eternity later, his ordeal finally ended. A Dutch Navy seaplane, part of a routine patrol, spotted the glint of the wreckage. The plane circled low, its engines a miraculous roar that shattered the oppressive silence. Wassing was winched to safety, dehydrated, sunburned, and in a state of near collapse. The first question he was asked, and the first he answered, was the one that would soon echo around the globe. "Where is the other man?" Through cracked lips, Wassing recounted the story. The swamped boat, the agonizing night adrift, and Michael's final, determined words before he slipped into the water, swimming for a shore that seemed a world away. The news of Michael Rockefeller's disappearance ignited a firestorm. This was not just any missing person. This was the scion of one of the world's most powerful families, vanished in one of its most remote corners. The Dutch colonial government, already managing a tense and difficult territory, launched one of the most extensive search and rescue operations in the history of the South Pacific. The Royal Dutch Navy dispatched ships, helicopters, and PBY Catalina flying boats. Australia sent aircraft from its own Royal Air Force. The search grid was immense, covering thousands of square miles of open sea and impenetrable coastline. Within days, Nelson and Mary Rockefeller, Michael's twin sister, arrived in New Guinea. The image of the powerful New York governor, his face etched with a father's anguish, stepping onto the dusty airstrip in Morocco, was broadcast worldwide. Nelson brought the full force of his family's influence to bear. He chartered his own Boeing 707, packed it with journalists, and hired private pilots and boats, refusing to accept the limitations of the official search. He was a man accustomed to shaping the world to his will, and he could not accept that his son might simply be gone. He flew in helicopters over the dense green canopy of the Azimuth, a landscape so thick and uniform it seemed to swallow the light. He peered down at the winding, mud-brown rivers and the featureless wall of the mangrove swamps, searching for any sign of life, any flicker of color that wasn't the suffocating green of the jungle. The official theory, and the one most readily accepted, was that Michael had drowned. The odds were overwhelmingly against him. He was an estimated 12 miles from shore, a distance that would challenge even an Olympic swimmer in calm conditions. The Arafura Sea, with its powerful, shifting currents, was anything but calm. He could have been pulled under by a riptide, succumbed to sheer exhaustion, or been overcome by hypothermia as his body temperature dropped in the water overnight. The other grim possibility was predation. The estuaries of the Asmat are prime territory for both saltwater crocodiles, some of the largest in the world, and several species of aggressive sharks. This explanation was tragic, but clean. It offered a form of closure, a narrative of man versus nature where nature, as it so often does, had won. After 9 days of fruitless searching, the Dutch government officially called off the operation. The official cause of Michael Rockefeller's disappearance was listed as drowned. Nelson Rockefeller, however, refused to give up. He stayed on, offering a massive reward, 250 pounds of tobacco, for any information, any artifact, any proof of his son's fate. He met with local officials, missionaries, and Asmat men who had been brought to the coastal towns. But the wall of silence was as impenetrable as the jungle itself. Eventually, hollowed by grief and with no leads to follow, he too was forced to concede defeat. He returned to New York, leaving behind a foundation to support the Asmat people, a final, desperate gesture of connection to the place that had claimed his son. But even as the official narrative settled into place, a different, more disturbing story was beginning to circulate. It was a story whispered by missionaries who had spent years among the Asmat, by low-level Dutch patrol officers, and by those who understood the complex, violent undercurrents of the local culture. This story did not end with Michael's body sinking into the sea. It began with him, exhausted but alive, pulling himself out of the water and onto the muddy banks of the Asmat coast. The area where Michael would have most likely made landfall was directly in the territory of two villages, Otsjanep and Omatisep, and these were not just any villages. Otsjanep, in particular, had a very specific and very recent history with the white world. In 1958, just 3 years before Michael disappeared, a Dutch patrol officer named Max Lapper had led a team into the region to establish government control. The expedition had ended in violence. A confrontation erupted between the Dutch patrol and warriors from Otsjanep, resulting in the Dutch opening fire and killing 5 of the village's most important and respected men. For the Dutch, it was a regrettable but necessary police action. For the Asmat of Otsjanep, it was a catastrophe that had thrown their world out of balance. In Asmat cosmology, a death, especially the death of a warrior at the hands of an enemy, creates a spiritual debt. The spirits of the slain are restless and angry, haunting the living and causing sickness and misfortune. The only way to appease these spirits and restore balance to the cosmos is through an act of reciprocal violence. A head for a head. The men of Otsjanep were now bound by a sacred obligation to kill a member of the tribe that had killed their own. To them, all white men were part of the same tribe, the White Tribe. They had been waiting for 3 years for an opportunity to settle the score. And then, one morning in November 1961, a figure stumbled out of the sea. He was alone, exhausted, and vulnerable. He was not a heavily armed patrol officer, but a single man easily overpowered, and he was white. He had, by a catastrophic stroke of fate, delivered himself directly into the hands of the very people who had the most powerful motive in their world to kill him. The whispers grew louder. Michael Rockefeller did not drown. He made it to shore, only to find himself at the center of a revenge ritual, the final, tragic piece in a puzzle that had been set in motion years before he ever dreamed of coming to New Guinea. The narrative that Michael Rockefeller had been killed by the Asmat people of Otsjanep remained, for years, a dark undercurrent, a story relegated to the shadows of official history. It was a deeply unsettling possibility, one that the Dutch colonial authorities, and certainly the Rockefeller family, had no interest in validating. It was far easier, politically and emotionally, to accept the clean, tragic finality of drowning. To acknowledge that a Rockefeller had been a victim of ritual headhunting would open a Pandora's box of colonial guilt, cultural misunderstanding, and gruesome detail that no one wanted to confront. The official story was sealed and the world moved on. But the whispers never truly died. They persisted among the few who knew the Asmat region intimately. Two Dutch Catholic priests, Father Cornelius van Kessel and Father Hubertus van Page, who had lived among the Asmat for years, were among the first to give the rumors credence. They had built relationships of trust within the communities, learned the languages, and understood the powerful cultural imperatives that governed Asmat life. Shortly after Michael's disappearance, Father Van Kessel began hearing specific, chilling accounts from his parishioners. They told him that warriors from Otstjanep had found Michael near the mouth of the Islandan River. They spoke of how he was speared, killed, and then taken into the village where his body was ritually butchered and consumed. The details were graphic and consistent. They even named the men who had allegedly struck the first blows. Father Van Kessel passed this information up the chain of command, both within his mission and to the colonial government. He believed it was the truth. His superiors, however, were horrified. They ordered him to be silent. The Dutch government, already in the precarious process of ceding control of West New Guinea to Indonesia, wanted no part of an international incident that would paint them as unable to control their territory or protect foreign nationals. The story was suppressed, and Father Van Kessel was eventually reassigned. The official file remained closed. Decades passed. The story of Michael Rockefeller faded into a kind of myth, a cautionary tale about a rich boy who wandered too far into the wild. It wasn't until 2014 that the case was forcefully ripped back into the public consciousness, largely through the work of a single journalist, Carl Hoffman. In his meticulously researched book, Savage Harvest, Hoffman unearthed a treasure trove of forgotten and suppressed evidence that gave powerful new life to the cannibalism theory. He traveled to the Asmat region himself, trekking through the same jungle and navigating the same rivers Michael had. More importantly, he gained access to the private correspondence and reports of the Dutch officials who were on the ground in 1961 and 1962. Hoffman's investigation uncovered the lost reports of Father Van Kessel, confirming the priest's early conviction. But the most explosive discovery was the evidence from a Dutch patrol officer named Wim van de Waal. Van de Waal was sent into the Otstjanep region in the spring of 1962, just a few months after Michael vanished. His mission was ostensibly to continue the work of pacification and census-taking, but he was also quietly instructed to investigate the rumors. In his reports, which Hoffman found in a dusty archive in the Netherlands, Van de Waal documented a series of stunning confessions. The men of Otstjanep, perhaps feeling the immediate threat had passed, began to talk. They told Van de Waal a story that was terrifying in its coherence. They said they were on a headhunting raid of their own when they saw a strange white crocodile in the water. A man swimming toward shore. They watched him crawl onto the riverbank. Exhausted. Initially, they were hesitant, but then they recognized him as belonging to the Tuan, the white tribe that had killed their kinsmen 3 years prior. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a gift from the spirits. According to their account, a warrior named Pep speared Michael in the ribs. He didn't die immediately. They brought him back to the village, still alive, where the full weight of their ritualistic purpose was brought to bear. They celebrated with a pesta, a ritual feast. The killing of an enemy, especially one who represented the tribe of their own slain warriors, was a moment of immense spiritual power. They performed the sacred headhunting dance, their bodies painted in chalk and ochre. They killed Michael with a final blow to the head, and then, in accordance with their most sacred traditions, they prepared his body. His head was taken, his brain cooked and consumed. His flesh was stripped from his bones, cooked with sago palm, and distributed among the villagers. His thigh bones were fashioned into daggers, his tibias into fishing spear points. Every part of him was absorbed into the life of the village. His power transferred, the cosmic balance finally restored. Van de Waal did not just collect stories. He collected physical evidence. The men of Otstjanep, believing he was a traitor, showed him bones. "These are the bones of the white man you are looking for," they told him. They presented him with a skull, which they claimed was Michael Rockefeller's. Van de Waal, deeply disturbed, recorded everything in his reports. He wrote that there was no doubt whatsoever that Michael had been killed and eaten by the people of Otstjanep. He sent his findings back to his superiors. The reaction was swift and decisive. Absolute denial. The Dutch administrator in the region, a man named Visser, dismissed the entire story as fantasy. He argued the Asmat were notorious liars, trying to impress the patrol officer with tall tales. The official directive from the highest levels of the colonial government was clear. The case was closed. The drowning narrative would stand. Wim van de Val's reports, along with the priests, were buried in the archives, destined to be forgotten. The skull he was shown was never recovered or officially examined. Hoffman, during his own journey to Otstjanep in the 21st century, found that the story was still alive, passed down through generations. He sat in a hut with the son of one of the men who had confessed to the killing. The translator for his expedition, a man from a neighboring village, spoke of the event as common knowledge. "Don't you tell this story to any other white man or any other village," he warned Hoffman, relaying the words of an Otstjanep elder. "Because this is a secret of ours." The shame and fear associated with the event still lingered. The act of killing Michael had, in their minds, brought a curse upon their village. A bad tide of sickness and misfortune that they believed was a direct result of their actions. The cycle of violence they had sought to end had only started a new, more insidious one within their own community. The spirit they had sought to appease was, it seemed, not at rest after all. The revelations brought forth by Karl Hoffman's investigation provided a powerful, coherent, and deeply disturbing answer to a mystery that had endured for over half a century. The narrative was no longer just a rumor whispered by missionaries and patrol officers. It was now substantially supported by a latticework of forgotten colonial documents, the first-hand testimony of those on the ground in the early 1960s, and the lingering, fearful oral history of the Asmat people themselves. The story that emerged was one of a perfect, tragic storm. A young man's adventurous spirit, born of privilege and intellectual curiosity, colliding with a culture's sacred, violent obligation. In this telling, Michael Rockefeller was not the victim of a random, savage attack, but the final, unwitting participant in a precise and meaningful ritual of revenge. He had stumbled out of the sea and into the conclusion of a story that had begun 3 years earlier with the guns of a Dutch patrol. This explanation, however, has never been officially accepted or publicly acknowledged by the Rockefeller family. To this day, the family maintains a dignified silence, implicitly holding to the original, official conclusion that Michael drowned at sea. It is an entirely understandable position, a necessary psychological shield against a truth that is almost unbearable in its horror. The idea of a son and brother succumbing to the impersonal forces of nature is a profound tragedy, one that allows for a conventional, albeit painful, form of grief. The idea of him being ritually killed and cannibalized is a horror of a different magnitude entirely. It invites a kind of grotesque sensationalism that the intensely private and powerful family has always sought to avoid. They have never issued a public statement on Hoffman's findings or the evidence he uncovered, choosing instead to let Michael's memory be defined by his passion for art and his adventurous life, rather than the speculative, gruesome details of his death. The most fitting and lasting memorial to Michael is, in fact, the one he was working to create. The Michael C. Rockefeller Wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which houses the collection of what was once his father's Museum of Primitive Art, stands as his true legacy. It is filled with many of the very types of objects he sought, some perhaps even collected during his final expedition. Walking through its halls, one can see the bistre poles, the carved shields, and the ceremonial drums that so captured his imagination. It is a testament to the world that fascinated him and, in the end, consumed him. The art is there, preserved and celebrated, but the dark, violent cosmology that gave it birth remains a world away, an uncomfortable context that is often smoothed over in the quiet, climate-controlled reverence of a museum gallery. The legacy of Michael's disappearance is complex and multi-layered, rippling far beyond the personal tragedy of his family. For the Asmat people of Otstjanep, the event became a dark and defining chapter in their own local history. The bad tide of sickness and misfortune they believed followed the killing was a very real phenomenon, likely a grim combination of communal psychological guilt and the continued, disruptive encroachment of outside diseases and influences. The story of the white man's death became a closely guarded secret, a source of both communal shame and a grim, complicated sense of identity. They had, in their worldview, fulfilled their most sacred spiritual duty, but in doing so, they had invited a new and lingering darkness into their own community. The incident marked a significant turning point, ironically accelerating the very cultural change that Michael had hoped to document before it vanished. The aggressive pacification programs that followed, first by the Dutch and then by the Indonesians who took control of the territory in 1962, along with the persistent influence of Christian missionaries, worked to systematically dismantle the traditions of headhunting and ritual violence that had led to Michael's death. The world he had sought to study was irrevocably altered by his own brief, tragic passage through it. Furthermore, the story serves as a stark and troubling case study in the ethics of anthropology and exploration, a subject still debated today. Michael Rockefeller was, by all accounts, a sensitive and respectful collector. He learned the language, traded fairly using goods the Asmat desired, and approached their culture with a scholar's curiosity, not a conqueror's arrogance. He was not a colonial exploiter in the traditional sense. Yet his very presence, and the presence of the powerful Western world he represented, was an undeniable catalyst for conflict. He sought to preserve a culture by collecting its artifacts, but in doing so, he entered a world whose fundamental rules he could not fully comprehend. His story highlights the profound, often unbridgeable gap between the observer and the observed, and the inherent dangers of romanticizing the primitive without fully grappling with the complex and often brutal realities of the cultures being studied. He saw the undeniable beauty and expressive power in the Asmat's art, but he fell victim to the violent cosmology from which that art was inseparable. The bisque poles were not just sculptures. They were demands for vengeance. The intricate carvings were not just decorations. They were intertwined with spirits and headhunting. He admired the product but was consumed by the process. His fate is a haunting reminder that cultural artifacts cannot be wholly divorced from the cultural imperatives that create them. Today, the mystery of Michael Rockefeller endures in the public imagination, not because of a genuine lack of evidence, but because of a collective reluctance to accept the most plausible yet most horrific conclusion. The story persists as a modern myth, a tale of the unknown, of the dark places supposedly left on the map where the rational rules of the modern world cease to apply. It taps into a primal fear of being lost, of being completely and utterly consumed by a wilderness that is not just geographical, but cultural and psychological. The official narrative of drowning offers a simple, if sad, ending that fits within our understanding of the world. The narrative of Savage Harvest offers something far more unsettling. A story about the violent collision of worlds, the haunting power of ritual, and the terrifyingly logical conclusion of a revenge cycle. No definitive physical evidence of Michael Rockefeller, no bone, no piece of clothing, no verifiable artifact, has ever been recovered and forensically identified. The skull that Patrol Officer Wim van de Waal was allegedly shown disappeared back into the fabric of the village and was never seen again by outsiders. Without testable DNA evidence, the case remains, in the strictest forensic sense of the word, unsolved. And perhaps that is how it will always stay. The mangrove swamps of the Asmat coast, with their labyrinthine waterways and deep, sucking mud, have kept their final secret. They stand as a silent, sprawling, and indifferent monument to a young man who went searching for the world's last mysteries, and in the end, became one of them. The most pressing question is no longer, what happened to Michael Rockefeller? The evidence points overwhelmingly toward one grim conclusion. The more enduring question is how we choose to tell the story of his end, and what parts of its difficult, violent, and deeply human truth we are willing or able to accept. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, the heir in California, in the spring of 1968 was thick with a strange, volatile mixture of hope and dread. It was a year that had already been brutally scarred. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam had shattered any remaining illusions of a swift victory, sending a shockwave of disillusionment across the nation. Just 2 months earlier, in April, The voice of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been silenced by an assassin's bullet in Memphis, and the cities had burned in response, great plumes of smoke rising from a nation's grief and rage. It was a time of deep schisms, of a generation gap that felt like a chasm, of a profound and violent tearing of the American social fabric. Yet, into this darkness, a new light seemed to be emerging. It was centered on the figure of Robert F. Kennedy. This was not the RFK of a few years prior, the tough, ruthless attorney general for his brother, President John F. Kennedy. The assassination of JFK in 1963 had hollowed him out, and in the intervening years, something new had been forged in that emptiness. He had emerged a changed man, his former hardness replaced by a deep and palpable empathy. He spoke for the marginalized, for the striking farm workers in California, the impoverished families in the Mississippi Delta, the desperate residents of inner-city ghettos, and the Native Americans on forgotten reservations. He had become a vessel for the hopes of those who felt left behind, a politician who seemed to genuinely feel the pain of his constituents. His run for the presidency in 1968 was a late entry, a reluctant crusade that quickly caught fire. He represented a path out of the quagmire of Vietnam and a promise of healing for a fractured country. His campaign was a chaotic, fervent, and intensely personal movement. The crowds that swarmed him were immense, desperate to touch him, to connect with him, as if he were a holy relic. He would dive into these masses, his security detail often lost in the crush, his hands grasping the hundreds of hands that reached for him. He seemed to draw energy from it, but it was a dangerous way to live, especially for a man named Kennedy in a decade defined by political violence. The night of June 4th, 1968, was the culmination of this energy. It was the night of the California Democratic primary, a critical winner-take-all contest. A victory here would give him the momentum he desperately needed to challenge the party establishment at the upcoming Democratic National Convention in Chicago. His campaign headquarters was the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, a grand, aging dame of a hotel on Wilshire Boulevard that had seen decades of Hollywood glamour and political power plays. That night, its famous Coconut Grove nightclub was transformed into a command center, buzzing with journalists, volunteers, and supporters. The ballroom was packed, a sea of expectant faces watching the returns come in on large television screens. The mood was electric, but tense. The race was agonizingly close. For hours, Kennedy and his opponent, Eugene McCarthy, traded the lead. Kennedy himself waited upstairs in the royal suite, surrounded by his family, friends, and trusted aides. He paced, watched the numbers, and tried to maintain a calm he did not feel. The fate of his entire campaign, and perhaps the nation's, hung on the outcome of this single night. Sometime after 11:30 p.m., the call came. The numbers had turned decisively in his favor. He had won. A wave of elation swept through the suite and down into the ballroom, which erupted in a deafening roar of triumph. The path to Chicago was now open. It was time to go down and claim the victory. Kennedy, dressed in a dark suit, his tie slightly loosened, made his way through the hotel's back corridors and service elevators, a necessary shortcut to bypass the impossibly dense crowds. He emerged onto the stage in the Embassy Room ballroom just after midnight on what was now June 5th. He looked tired but radiant, his face illuminated by the hot glare of the television lights and the adoration of the crowd. He gave a speech that was gracious and hopeful. He thanked his supporters, his wife Ethel, who was pregnant with their 11th child, his staff, and even his dog, Freckles. He spoke of unity, of bridging the divides that plagued the country. "What I think is quite clear," he said, "is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on in the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the division, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, we can start to work together. We are a great country, an unselfish country and a compassionate country." He ended with a now famous and deeply poignant line, flashing a V for Victory sign. "So my thanks to all of you, and on to Chicago, and let's win there." The crowd cheered wildly. The speech was over. His next stop was another press conference in a different room of the hotel. To get there, the plan was to cut through a kitchen pantry area behind the ballroom stage. It was a chaotic, narrow corridor, filled with food service carts, steam tables, and kitchen staff who had paused their work to catch a glimpse of the charismatic candidate. It was seen as the fastest, most direct route, a way to avoid the human tidal wave waiting for him in the main ballroom. But lurking in that crowd, a shadow amidst the celebration, was a 24-year-old man named Sirhan, a Palestinian Christian immigrant from Jordan. Sirhan was a small, quiet man who harbored a deep and burning rage against Kennedy. This rage was political, rooted in Kennedy's support for Israel, particularly his recent promise to send 50 fighter jets to the Israeli military. To Sirhan, this was a profound betrayal of the Palestinian people. His anger had festered into a murderous obsession. In a spiral notebook found later in his home, he had scribbled chilling, repetitive phrases: RFK must be disposed of. RFK must be killed. Robert F. Kennedy must be assassinated before June 5, 1968. The deadline he had set for himself had now arrived. All evening, Sirhan had been waiting. He had visited a shooting range earlier that day. He carried a .22 caliber Iver Johnson cadet revolver, tucked away in his pocket. He had asked a campaign volunteer when Kennedy would be speaking and had been loitering near the stage, blending into the background, his face an emotionless mask. As Kennedy left the stage, he was immediately enveloped by people. His security guard, former FBI agent Bill Barry, tried to clear a path. Kennedy, ever the politician, turned to his left to shake hands with the kitchen workers who had gathered to see him. He greeted a busboy named Juan Romero, shaking his hand warmly. In that moment of connection, of a brief human exchange between the potential future president and a young hotel worker, the world changed forever. From out of the crowd, Sirhan lunged forward. He was swift and purposeful. He raised the small revolver and, from a distance of only a few feet, began firing. The sound was small, a series of sharp, popping noises, like firecrackers or flashbulbs exploding, almost lost in the din of the pantry. But the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Kennedy's hand dropped from Romero's. His eyes went blank with shock. He raised his hands to protect his head as his body began to crumple. A slow, graceful fall, as if his strings had been cut. The victorious cheers from the ballroom were instantly replaced by the piercing sound of screams from the pantry. The brief, shining moment of hope was over. A new and far darker American tragedy had just begun. In the immediate aftermath of the shots, the narrow kitchen pantry of the Ambassador Hotel was transformed into a tableau of surreal horror. For a fraction of a second, there was only confusion. The popping sounds had not registered as gunfire to everyone, but the sight of Robert Kennedy falling was an undeniable, world-altering event. He crumpled not in a sudden, violent spasm, but in a slow, almost gentle collapse, as if the life force were simply draining out of him. Juan Romero, the 17-year-old busboy whose hand Kennedy had just been shaking, instinctively knelt down. He cradled the senator's head in his hands, trying to shield him from the cold, greasy concrete floor. He saw the vacant look in Kennedy's eyes and, in a gesture of pure, desperate humanity, pressed a set of rosary beads into his hand. While Romero tended to the fallen senator, a different kind of chaos erupted around the assailant. Sirhan was still standing, his arm extended, the small revolver still gripped in his hand, attempting to continue firing, but he was immediately swarmed. A wave of bodies crashed into him, driven by a primal mixture of rage and protective instinct. These were not all professional bodyguards. They were writers, athletes, and campaign aides who reacted with raw courage. The author George Plimpton was one of the first to reach him, grabbing Sirhan's arm and forcing it down onto a steam table. Then came Rafer Johnson, the celebrated Olympic decathlon champion, and Rosie Greer, a formidable professional football player. What followed was a desperate, violent struggle for the gun. Sirhan, though small in stature, was filled with a fanatic strength. He fought furiously, his face a chillingly blank mask. Greer, Johnson, and others wrestled with him, their hands closing over his, trying to pry the weapon from his grip. "Get the gun, Rafer! Get the gun!" someone yelled. For agonizing seconds, the struggle continued. Sirhan's finger was still on the trigger, and the gun discharged several more times into the ceiling and walls before Rafer Johnson finally managed to wrench it from his grasp. Greer held Sirhan down on the steam table, his massive hand covering the assailant's face, trying to contain the source of the nightmare. As Sirhan was being subdued, the focus returned to the man on the floor. Kennedy was conscious. His eyes flickered open, taking in the scene of chaos and panic around him. His first words, whispered to those leaning over him, were not of his own pain, but of a disoriented, selfless concern. "Is everybody okay?" he asked. His wife, Ethel, who had been just steps behind him, rushed to his side. She knelt in the grime of the pantry floor, stroking his face, murmuring words of comfort, her small frame radiating a fierce, protective energy. She waved away the crush of onlookers, trying to create a small pocket of peace in the heart of the pandemonium. It soon became clear that Kennedy was not the only victim. In his wild firing, Sirhan had wounded 5 other people. Paul Schrade, a United Auto Workers official and friend of Kennedy's, was standing behind him and was struck in the forehead. William Wiesel, a reporter for ABC News, was hit in the abdomen. Ira Goldstein of the Continental News Service was wounded in the hip. A campaign volunteer, Erwin Stroll, was shot in the leg, and a young woman named Elizabeth Evans was grazed on the forehead by a bullet that had first ricocheted off a wall. The pantry was now a scene of multiple casualties. A chaotic emergency room floor slick with spilled food and blood. The wait for medical help felt like an eternity. The hotel's doctor arrived, unbuttoning Kennedy's shirt and tie, trying to assess the wounds. The most critical one was not immediately obvious. A small, dark hole was visible just behind his right ear, where the fatal bullet had entered. 2 other bullets had struck him from behind, one lodging in his right armpit and the other exiting his chest. Paramedics finally pushed their way through the throng with a stretcher. As they lifted Kennedy, Ethel held his hand, walking beside him, her face a mask of stoic grief. The journey out of the hotel was a horrifying spectacle. They had to pass back through the edge of the embassy ballroom, where only minutes before, a crowd had been cheering for victory. Now, that same crowd was a sea of stunned, weeping faces, their campaign hats and celebratory signs suddenly looking like relics from another lifetime. The news was spreading in confused, panicked waves. "He's been shot." The words rippled through the room. "Kennedy's been shot." The triumphant music had been cut off, replaced by a low hum of shock and the approaching wail of sirens. Kennedy was rushed by ambulance to the nearby Central Receiving Hospital, a facility equipped for basic emergencies but not for the complex neurosurgery he desperately needed. The diagnosis there was swift and grim. The bullet behind his ear had entered his skull, sending fragments of bone and metal plowing deep into his brain. He needed to be moved immediately. He was transferred to the Good Samaritan Hospital several miles away, a facility with one of the best neurosurgical teams in the country. As the ambulance sped through the streets of Los Angeles, the world began to learn what had happened. News anchors broke into late-night programming, their faces pale, their voices strained with disbelief. It was a ghastly echo of 5 years earlier. Kennedy had been shot again. The hope that had been so palpable just an hour before curdled into a nationwide vigil of despair. Crowds began to gather outside the Good Samaritan Hospital, their faces illuminated by the flickering of candles, standing in silent, prayerful solidarity. The scenes were broadcast across the country, a nation collectively holding its breath, praying for a miracle. Inside the hospital, a team of surgeons led by Dr. Maxwell Hunter began a desperate marathon operation. For nearly 4 hours, they worked meticulously to remove the bullet and the numerous fragments that had scattered throughout the right side of his brain. But the damage was catastrophic and irreversible. The bullet had torn through the cerebellum and other vital areas that control the body's essential functions. Meanwhile, Sirhan had been dragged out of the hotel and thrown into the back of a police car. He was eerily calm, almost serene, at the police station as he was being booked. Some reporters noted that he was smiling, a faint, detached smirk on his face as if he were an observer to the tragedy, not its architect. His pockets contained the .22 revolver, 2 spare clips of ammunition, and $4. The investigation into his motives began almost immediately, and the discovery of his hate-filled notebooks would soon provide a clear, if chilling, rationale. He had not been a random madman, but a political assassin with a very specific and deeply held grievance. Back at the hospital, the long surgery ended. The official medical bulletins were carefully worded but offered little hope. Kennedy had survived the operation, but he was in extremely critical condition. He never regained consciousness. The vibrant, empathetic voice that had captivated a nation was silent. For the next 22 hours, Robert F. Kennedy lay in a hospital bed, kept alive by machines, while his family gathered, and the world waited and prayed and mourned a loss that already felt complete. As Robert F. Kennedy lay silent in his room at Good Samaritan Hospital, the world outside grappled with the implications of what had just happened. The 22 hours between the shooting and the final, inevitable announcement were a period of suspended animation. A national wake held while the victim was still technically alive. The thin, clinical language of the medical bulletins, extremely critical condition, no improvement, did little to soften the blow. Everyone knew what was coming. The assassination attempt had not just been a physical assault on a man. It was an assault on an idea, the idea that America, even in its most turbulent hour, could be healed and brought together. At 1:44 a.m. on the morning of June 6, 1968, nearly 26 hours after he had been shot, Robert F. Kennedy died. He was 42 years old. Frank Mankiewicz, Kennedy's press secretary, a man whose face had become a familiar symbol of the agonizing vigil, stepped before a phalanx of cameras and microphones at the hospital. His voice was heavy with exhaustion and grief as he read a short, prepared statement. "I have a short announcement to read, which I will read at this time," he began, his composure cracking. Senator Robert Francis Kennedy died at 1:44 a.m. today, June 6, 1968. With Senator Kennedy at the time of his death were his wife Ethel, his sisters Mrs. Stephen Smith, Mrs. Patricia Lawford, his brother-in-law Mr. Stephen Smith, and his sister-in-law Mrs. John F. Kennedy. He was 42 years old. Thank you. The news washed over the country like a cold tide. The flickering hope that had been kept alive by machines and prayers was extinguished. For many, especially the young and the disenfranchised who had seen Kennedy as their last, best hope, the sense of despair was absolute. It felt as if the promise of the 1960s, already so tarnished by war and violence, had died with him on that hospital bed. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. had been a blow to the nation's conscience. The assassination of Robert Kennedy felt like a blow to its heart. The investigation into the crime, meanwhile, was proceeding with grim efficiency. Sirhan was in custody, and his motive seemed straightforward. His notebooks were a chilling testament to a premeditated, politically motivated murder. His anger over Kennedy's pro-Israel stance, particularly in the context of the recent first anniversary of the Six-Day War, was the clear and driving force. He was an open and shut case, a lone, fanatical assassin who had acted on his own. This was the narrative the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, quickly embraced and promoted. It was simple, it was clean, and it offered a contained explanation for an event that felt incomprehensibly chaotic. However, from the very beginning, strange and unsettling details began to surface, details that didn't quite fit the tidy official story. These were small cracks in the foundation of the lone gunman theory, anomalies that would grow over the years into a full-blown controversy, feeding a persistent belief that the truth of what happened in that pantry was far more complex. One of the most significant and enduring questions centered on the number of bullets fired. Sirhan's Ever Johnson cadet revolver held only 8 bullets. Police investigators confirmed that all 8 shots had been accounted for, 3 that struck Kennedy, and 5 that wounded the other victims. Yet, a growing number of eyewitnesses from the pantry reported hearing more than 8 shots. Some claimed to have heard as many as 10, 12, or even 13 pops. These were not just casual observers. They were journalists and law enforcement officials who were accustomed to processing chaotic scenes. While auditory memory in a traumatic event can be notoriously unreliable, the consistency of these accounts was striking. More troubling was the physical evidence. An FBI agent on the scene, William A. Bailey, later claimed in a sworn affidavit that he observed at least 2 bullet holes in the wooden door frames of the pantry, in addition to the bullets that had hit the victims. Another witness, a high school student named Scott Enyart who was taking photographs, also claimed to have seen these extra bullet holes. This physical evidence, if it existed, would have been irrefutable proof of a second gun. Yet, the LAPD's official investigation made no mention of these holes. In a baffling and highly suspicious move, the LAPD removed the door frames and a ceiling tile that was also believed to contain a bullet hole. They were later destroyed, officially as part of a routine clearing out of evidence. This act of destroying crucial physical evidence has fueled conspiracy theories for decades, suggesting a deliberate cover-up. Then there was the question of the bullets themselves. An autopsy performed by the renowned Los Angeles County Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, produced the most damning evidence against the lone gunman theory. Noguchi's meticulous examination revealed that all 3 bullets that struck Kennedy were fired from behind him, at a steep upward angle. The fatal shot, the one behind his right ear, was fired from a distance of no more than 1 to 3 inches, leaving powder burns on his skin. This was the smoking gun of the autopsy report, and it created a direct, seemingly irreconcilable contradiction with the eyewitness accounts. Every single witness who was in a position to see the shooting, including Juan Romero who was holding Kennedy's hand, placed Sirhan in front of Kennedy, never behind him. They described Sirhan approaching from the front, reaching over a steam table, and firing from a distance of several feet away. There was no moment when Sirhan was close enough, or positioned correctly, to fire a contact shot into the back of Kennedy's head. Noguchi himself, a man of unimpeachable professional integrity, stated publicly and repeatedly that his forensic findings were not consistent with Sirhan being the sole shooter. "There is no doubt in my mind," he would later write, "that Sirhan was not the only one firing a gun in that pantry." These discrepancies gave rise to the theory of a second gunman, a shadowy accomplice who was standing behind Kennedy and fired the fatal shots in the chaos of Sirhan's initial attack. The theory posits that Sirhan was a diversion, a patsy designed to draw all the attention while the Real assassin delivered the kill shots from point-blank range. This theory was bolstered by the presence of a mysterious girl in the polka-dot dress. Several witnesses, both before and immediately after the shooting, reported seeing a young woman in a polka-dot dress with a male companion. Some claimed to have seen her with Sirhan earlier in the evening. More chillingly, a campaign volunteer named Sandra Serrano, who had left the ballroom just before the shooting, claimed that the woman ran past her in a state of manic excitement, exclaiming, "We shot him! We shot him!" When Serrano asked who they had shot, the woman allegedly replied, "Senator Kennedy." This encounter would have taken place before most people even knew Kennedy had been hit. The police interviewed the woman, but ultimately dismissed her as an attention-seeking teenager, and the lead was dropped. The identity of the girl in the polka-dot dress remains one of the case's most tantalizing and unresolved mysteries. Despite the swirling questions and the profound contradictions emerging between eyewitness testimony and forensic science, the legal path forward was swift and narrow. The trial of Sirhan began in Los Angeles in January 1969. From the outset, the prosecution's case was simple and unwavering. Sirhan and Sirhan alone, motivated by a fanatical political hatred, had assassinated Senator Kennedy. They presented the notebooks with their chilling, repetitive scrawls of "RFK must be killed" as irrefutable proof of premeditation. They had the weapon, eyewitnesses who saw him firing, and a confession of motive in his own hand. For the district attorney, the case was sealed. Sirhan's defense team, led by attorney Grant Cooper, made a fateful and controversial decision. They never argued that Sirhan did not shoot at Kennedy. Instead, they built their entire case around a defense of diminished capacity. They argued that Sirhan, while physically responsible for the act, was mentally incapable of premeditated murder due to a fragile, psychotic state. They portrayed him as a disturbed and confused young man who had been in a kind of trance, perhaps triggered by the flashing lights and mirrors in the pantry, a state that rendered him unable to form the specific intent required for a first-degree murder conviction. Sirhan himself was a bizarre and erratic presence in the courtroom, at times smiling oddly, at others flying into rages. He did little to help his own cause. Crucially, because the defense conceded that Sirhan had fired the shots, the explosive forensic evidence presented by Dr. Thomas Noguchi was never fully explored or challenged in court. The prosecution had no interest in complicating their neat narrative, and the defense was focused on Sirhan's state of mind, not the ballistics. The questions about extra bullet holes, the impossibly close range of the fatal shot, and the position of the shooter were largely ignored or downplayed. The court, and by extension the official record, accepted the simple version of events. In April 1969, the jury found Sirhan guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. The sentence was automatically commuted to life in prison in 1972 when the California Supreme Court briefly outlawed capital punishment. The legal resolution, however, did little to resolve the historical one. The death of Robert Kennedy was not just another crime. It was a profound historical inflection point. The impact on the 1968 presidential election was immediate and catastrophic for the Democratic Party. The anti-war, progressive energy that had coalesced around Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy now had no viable leader. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago that August descended into a televised nightmare. As the party bosses inside the convention hall nominated the establishment candidate, Vice President Hubert Humphrey, the streets outside exploded in violence. Police brutally clashed with anti-war protesters, and the images of tear gas, billy clubs, and bleeding youths were broadcast into American living rooms, showcasing a nation and a party at war with itself. The chaos of Chicago became a potent symbol of a society unraveling. It paved the way for the victory of Richard Nixon, who ran on a powerful platform of law and order, promising to restore stability to a nation terrified by what it saw as spiraling anarchy. Kennedy's death had not only removed a candidate, it had removed a narrative of hope and reconciliation, replacing it with a narrative of fear and division that would define American politics for years to come. Many historians argue that this was the moment the optimism of the 1960s was finally and irrevocably broken, the point at which the counterculture's dream of changing the world from within the system died. The cumulative trauma of the triple assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., and Robert Kennedy carved a deep psychic wound in the American consciousness. It fostered a pervasive cynicism about the possibility of meaningful change and the integrity of the political process. The belief that a single, charismatic leader could inspire the country to overcome its divisions seemed to have been executed along with the men themselves. A darkness had fallen, a suspicion that unseen, malevolent forces were at work, eliminating any leader who posed a genuine threat to the established order. It is this profound sense of a stolen future that keeps the questions about Kennedy's death alive. The conspiracy theories persist not merely because people enjoy speculation, but because the official story, promoted by the LAPD and sealed by the court, is so glaringly flawed. The destruction of the pantry door frames and ceiling tiles by the LAPD remains one of the most inexcusable acts in the history of modern American criminal investigation. Dr. Noguchi's autopsy report stands as a permanent, scientific rebuke to the official narrative. In the decades since, key witnesses have strengthened their accounts, and even some involved in the original investigation have expressed grave doubts. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has publicly stated that he does not believe Sirhan killed his father and has joined a chorus of voices calling for a full reinvestigation of the case. Armed with modern forensic techniques, Sirhan remains in prison in California. At his parole hearings over the years, he has often claimed to have no memory of the shooting, a position consistent with his original defense but one that only deepens the mystery. Was he a hypnotized pawn, a Manchurian Candidate program to create a diversion, as some of the more elaborate theories suggest? Or is he simply a manipulative killer, feigning amnesia to shirk the final measure of responsibility? Ultimately, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy is not just a cold case. It is a wound in the American timeline, a moment where the course of history visibly bent in a darker direction. The pantry of the Ambassador Hotel, a space that no longer exists, as the hotel was demolished in 2005, remains a kind of black box in the nation's memory. The full truth of the 81 seconds of chaos within its walls may never be officially known. The unanswered questions linger, not as trivial footnotes, but as haunting reminders of what was lost. A man, a campaign, and a fragile, fleeting vision of a more compassionate and unified America. The ghost of that possible future, and the violent, unresolved manner of its death, is a presence that continues to haunt the country to this day. The Oklahoma City bombing the morning of April 19, 1995, dawned cool and bright over Oklahoma City. It was a Wednesday, a day that promised nothing more than the gentle, unremarkable rhythm of midweek life in the American heartland. A light breeze rustled the new spring leaves on the trees. Commuters made their way downtown, coffee in hand, radios murmuring with news and traffic reports. Parents dropped their children off at schools and daycare centers, a routine exchange of hurried kisses and promises for later. In the heart of the city at 200 Northwest 5th Street, the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building stood as a sturdy, if architecturally uninspired, symbol of order and bureaucracy. The 9-story structure, built of reinforced concrete and tinted glass, was a hub of federal activity. It housed the regional offices for the Social Security Administration, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, among others. It was a place of paperwork, of deadlines, of quiet service to the public. For the hundreds of federal employees who worked there, it was simply the office. It was a place you went to earn a living, to chat with colleagues by the water cooler, to count down the hours until the weekend. On the second floor, however, the building held something far more precious than government files. It was the home of the America's Kids Daycare Center. This was a place of vibrant, chaotic life. On that particular morning, its rooms were filled with the sounds of children's laughter, the bright primary colors of toys, and the gentle guidance of caregivers. It was a place of finger paints and nap times, a small, trusting world nestled within the institutional gray of the larger structure. For many of the federal employees, having their children just a few floors below them was a profound comfort, a weaving together of their work and family lives. Shortly before 9 a.m., a yellow Ryder rental truck, boxy and unremarkable, made its way through the downtown streets. It pulled into the drop-off zone directly in front of the Murrah Building's glass-fronted north face. A young man with a military-style crew cut stepped out of the driver's side. He was calm and deliberate. He locked the truck and began walking away, disappearing into the city's morning bustle. He did not look back. The truck sat there, idling for a moment before its engine fell silent. Just another delivery vehicle on a busy city street. No one paid it much attention. Inside the building, the day's work had begun. People were settling at their desks. Computers were humming to life. And in the daycare, children were finishing their morning snacks. The clock on the wall ticked toward 9 a.m. At 2 minutes past the hour, the world ended. The Ryder truck contained a bomb of monstrous and horrifying simplicity. It was a 4,800-pound mixture of ammonium nitrate, a common agricultural fertilizer, and nitromethane, a high-octane racing fuel. It was a weapon of mass destruction, built from materials that could be bought in any rural supply store, parked on a public street in the heart of a major American city. The explosion was not just a sound. It was a physical event that seemed to unmake reality itself. For those inside the Murrah Building, there was no warning. There was only a sudden, incomprehensible concussion of force, a shockwave that slammed into the building with the power of a localized earthquake. The glass on the north face of the building didn't just shatter. It vaporized, turning into a supersonic cloud of razor-sharp shrapnel. The reinforced concrete support columns, the very bones of the structure, were pulverized into dust. In less than a second, 1/3 of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building ceased to exist. The entire north-facing section pancaked downward, floor collapsing onto floor in a cascade of concrete, steel, and human life. Desks, filing cabinets, computers, and people were compressed into a 9-story pile of rubble. The second-floor daycare center, positioned directly above the blast's epicenter, was obliterated almost instantly. A place of laughter and life was transformed into an unspeakable void. The sound of the blast rolled across Oklahoma City and for miles beyond. A deep, guttural roar that rattled windows and shook the ground. A pillar of black and gray smoke, thick with pulverized concrete and the artifacts of hundreds of lives, billowed thousands of feet into the clear morning sky. For blocks around the Murrah building, the scene was apocalyptic. Cars were incinerated where they were parked. Windows were blown out of buildings a half-mile away. The street was littered with smoking debris, twisted metal, and a blanket of white dust that covered everything like a chemical snow. In the immediate aftermath, there was a moment of profound and unnatural silence, the world holding its breath, deafened by the blast. Then came the screams. Out of the dust and chaos, survivors began to emerge. They were the walking wounded, dazed, bleeding, covered in a ghostly gray film. They stumbled out of the wreckage and from the surrounding buildings, their minds struggling to process what had just happened. Was it a gas leak? An earthquake? A plane crash? The idea of a bomb, of a deliberate act of this magnitude, was too monstrous to immediately comprehend. First responders began arriving within minutes, and they were met with a scene that defied all training and expectation. They were not responding to an accident. They had arrived at a war zone. The Murrah building, or what was left of it, was a grotesque, gaping wound in the city's skyline. Its entire north side was sheared off, leaving the building exposed like a giant, ravaged dollhouse. They could see remnants of offices, a tipped-over plant, a picture still hanging crookedly on a wall, all teetering on the edge of a precipice. Fires burned deep within the rubble, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and concrete dust. The rescue effort began immediately, a frantic and heroic scramble into an unstable, treacherous environment. Police officers, firefighters, and paramedics were joined by ordinary citizens. Construction workers in hard hats, office workers in torn suits, who began clawing at the rubble with their bare hands, desperate to find anyone alive. The scale of the devastation was overwhelming. The sheer tonnage of collapsed concrete made rescue efforts agonizingly slow and dangerous. Every so often, a survivor would be pulled from the debris, a small, miraculous victory in a landscape of overwhelming loss. But it was the dawning realization of what had happened on the second floor that plunged the city into its deepest state of horror. As rescuers fought their way toward the front of the building, they began to find the first signs of the daycare. A child's shoe, a broken toy, a small, lifeless body. The news spread through the ranks of the first responders and out to the public with sickening speed. There had been a daycare full of children inside. That knowledge changed the emotional texture of the tragedy from one of shock to one of profound, soul-crushing heartbreak. The image that would come to define the day for the entire world was not far behind. A photographer captured the moment as city firefighter, Chris Fields, cradled the small, limp body of a 1-year-old girl named Bailey Allman, his face a mask of anguish. That single photograph captured the innocence of the victims and the sheer, senseless evil of the act. Oklahoma City was no longer just the site of a disaster. It was the site of a massacre. The question was no longer just what had happened, but who could have possibly done this and why. The largest criminal investigation in American history was about to begin. In the hours and days that followed the explosion, Oklahoma City became a place of two realities, existing side by side. The first was a scene of unrelenting, heartbreaking rescue. The collapsed north face of the Murrah building, a 9-story tomb of concrete and steel, became known simply as the Pile. It was a treacherous, unstable mass of debris that rescuers navigated with a courage bordering on the sublime. For 16 days, teams worked around the clock under the glare of floodlights. In a landscape of twisted rebar and pulverized office furniture, they formed human chains to pass 5-gallon buckets of rubble away from the site. One by one, they brought in heavy cranes to lift massive slabs of concrete, a process so delicate that a single miscalculation could trigger a further collapse. The work was physically grueling and emotionally shattering. Rescuers listened with sensitive acoustic equipment for any sound of life, any faint tap or cry from beneath the tons of debris. Each person brought out alive was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy that rippled through the exhausted crews. But these moments were tragically few. Far more often, the work involved the grim, sacred duty of recovery. The silence that fell over the entire site whenever a victim was found was a profound, shared expression of reverence and sorrow. The nation watched, unified in a way it hadn't been for decades, holding its breath with every news report, sending waves of prayer, support, and donations to a city that had become the heart of America's grief. The second reality was the investigation. Even as the rescue effort was at its peak, the largest criminal investigation in the nation's history was launched with ferocious intensity. The FBI designated the case Akbom. The immediate assumption, colored by the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was that this was the work of international terrorists. Experts on Middle Eastern extremist groups were consulted, and for a short time, the nation's anger was directed outward. But the evidence on the ground was beginning to tell a different story. The key was the delivery vehicle. Investigators knew from the blast pattern and the crater in the street that the bomb had been inside a truck. They began the painstaking process of sifting through the wreckage, not just for human remains, but for any fragment of the vehicle that had delivered this devastation. In the chaos of shredded steel and incinerated cars, the task seemed impossible. But then came the breakthrough. An FBI agent discovered a piece of twisted metal a block away from the site. It was part of a truck's rear axle, and on that axle, miraculously intact, was a small, stamped metal plate containing the vehicle identification number, or VIN. This was the needle in the haystack. It was the crucial thread that could unravel the entire plot. The VIN was traced with incredible speed. It belonged to a 1993 Ford F700, part of the Ryder rental fleet. Ryder's national database was searched, and the number was matched to a specific truck, rented 2 days prior from a place called Elliott's Body Shop in Junction City, Kansas, about 280 miles north of Oklahoma City. Suddenly, the vast, anonymous scope of the investigation had a geographic anchor. A team of agents was immediately dispatched to Junction City. At Elliott's Body Shop, the owner, Eldon Elliott, and his employees provided the next critical pieces of the puzzle. They remembered the man who had rented the truck. He had used a fake driver's license under the name Robert D. Kling. He was calm, polite, and paid in cash. He had arrived with another, shorter, dark-haired man who had waited in the car. Working with an FBI artist, the employees at Elliott's provided a description that became the basis for a composite sketch of the primary suspect, the man known as Robert Kling, or John Doe Number 1. The sketch of his accomplice, John Doe Number 2, was also created, though the descriptions were less clear. On April 20th, the sketches were released to the public and broadcast across the world. The faceless killer now had a face. As this massive federal manhunt was gaining momentum, a seemingly unrelated event had already taken place, unnoticed by the world. About 90 minutes after the bombing on April 19th, an Oklahoma Highway Patrol trooper named Charlie Hanger was on routine patrol on Interstate 35, about 80 miles north of the blast site. He spotted a beat-up, pale yellow 1977 Mercury Marquis sedan driving without a license plate. He pulled the car over. The driver was a tall, lanky young man with a military-style buzz cut. He was calm, cooperative, and articulate. He told the trooper he was in the process of moving and had just bought the car. His name, he said, was Timothy McVeigh. As part of the routine stop, Trooper Hanger noticed a bulge under McVeigh's jacket. He asked him to step out of the car. A quick pat-down revealed a loaded 9mm Glock pistol in a shoulder holster. In Oklahoma, carrying a concealed weapon without a permit was a felony. McVeigh was arrested on state firearms and traffic charges. He was handcuffed and taken to the Noble County Jail in the small town of Perry, Oklahoma. He was booked, fingerprinted, and placed in a cell. To Trooper Hanger and the staff at the county jail, he was just another routine arrest, another transient caught with an illegal gun. They had no idea that the most wanted man in America, the architect of the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in the nation's history, was sitting quietly in their custody. Back in Junction City, the FBI's sketch of Robert Kling was having its intended effect. The manager of a local motel, the Dreamland, recognized the face instantly. It was the man who had checked into her motel on April 14th under his real name, Timothy McVeigh. The name was a lightning bolt. It was the final critical link. FBI agents ran the name through the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, a vast database of criminal and arrest records. The result that came back was stunning. Timothy McVeigh was not a fugitive. He was not a ghost. He was, at that very moment, in custody in the Noble County Jail, less than 2 hours away from the crime scene. A frantic, desperate race against time began. McVeigh was being held on state charges. His initial court appearance was scheduled for the afternoon of April 21st. It was entirely possible that he could post bail, walk out the front door of the jail, and vanish forever. The FBI scrambled, working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to file a federal complaint that would allow them to take custody of him, as McVeigh was being led from his cell to his court hearing, unaware that his fake identity had been compromised. The jail's administrative office was being inundated with frantic calls from the FBI. "Do not release that man," they were told. "He is the subject of a federal investigation." The local sheriff's deputies, bewildered but compliant, held McVeigh. Within hours, the small town of Perry was swarming with federal agents. When Timothy McVeigh was finally led out of the courthouse, flanked by FBI agents, the world saw him for the first time, dressed in a bright orange prison jumpsuit, his face set in a defiant, emotionless mask. He was the embodiment of a shocking new reality. The man responsible for the carnage in Oklahoma City was not a foreign enemy from a distant land. He was one of their own, a young, white American male, a decorated combat veteran of the U.S. Army who had served his country in the Persian Gulf War. The question of who had been answered. The far more disturbing question of why was just beginning to unfold. With Timothy McVeigh in custody, the portrait of the conspiracy began to take shape with horrifying clarity. The investigation peeled back the layers of his life, revealing a man transformed by a toxic cocktail of disillusionment, paranoia, and a deep-seated rage against the United States federal government. McVeigh was not a simple-minded fanatic. He was intelligent, disciplined, and methodical. Born in upstate New York, he had a lonely childhood and found a sense of purpose and belonging in the U.S. Army. He was a model soldier, an expert marksman who served with distinction in the First Gulf War, earning a Bronze Star for his service. He was, by all accounts, exactly the kind of man who should have been a pillar of the society he came to despise. But his experience in the military also sowed the seeds of his dissent. He was disgusted by what he saw as the government's willingness to use its soldiers as pawns. After failing to pass the grueling selection process for the Army's elite Green Berets, a deep-seated ambition of his, a sense of rejection set in. He left the military in 1991 and drifted, unable to find his place in the civilian world he had fought to protect. He fell into a nomadic lifestyle, traveling the country and absorbing the rhetoric of the burgeoning anti-government patriot movement of the early 1990s. He became a devotee of the Turner Diaries, a white supremacist novel that depicts a fictional guerrilla war against the U.S. government, culminating in the bombing of an FBI headquarters. For McVeigh, this book was not fiction. It was a blueprint. The catalyst that turned his abstract anger into a concrete plan for mass murder was a date on the calendar. April 19th. This date held a grim, symbolic power for McVeigh and the broader patriot movement. On April 19th, 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord, a day McVeigh saw as a heroic stand against a tyrannical government. Far more significantly, April 19th, 1993, was the day the federal government's deadly siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, ended in a fiery inferno that killed more than 75 people, including many women and children. For McVeigh, Waco was a transformative event. He had traveled to the site during the 51-day standoff, selling bumper stickers and talking with protesters. He saw the government's actions not as a law enforcement operation, but as an act of mass murder, a tyrannical government slaughtering its own citizens. The fire at Waco confirmed all of his darkest beliefs. he became obsessed with revenge. He wanted to wake up America. He wanted to deliver a blow to the federal government so devastating it would spark a second American Revolution. He chose the Alfred P. Murrah Building for its symbolic value, housing federal agencies he particularly despised, especially the ATF, which had been a key player at Waco. The fact that it also housed a daycare center was, in his chilling calculus, irrelevant collateral damage. He considered the children, like all who worked in the building, to be part of the stormtroopers of a corrupt regime. As the details of McVeigh's life came to light, the investigation focused on his known associates. The most important of these was Terry Nichols, an old Army buddy who shared McVeigh's anti-government views. Nichols was a quieter, more domestic figure than McVeigh, a man with a family who had tried and failed at various small businesses. He was more of a follower, easily swayed by McVeigh's charismatic certainty. Investigators quickly discovered that Nichols had helped McVeigh in the critical planning and preparation stages of the attack. Together, they had purchased and stolen the raw materials for the bomb, including tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer and barrels of nitromethane. They experimented with smaller explosives on Nichols's farm in Kansas, honing their deadly craft. Terry Nichols surrendered to police in Harrington, Kansas, shortly after hearing his name broadcast. On the news, he initially cooperated, but his story was full of half-truths and evasions. The search also continued for the mysterious John Doe No. 2, the second man who had allegedly been with McVeigh when he rented the Ryder truck. The FBI pursued this lead with immense resources, interviewing hundreds of people and chasing down countless tips. The search eventually led them to a man named Todd Bunting, an Army private who vaguely resembled the composite sketch and had no connection to the plot. The John Doe No. 2 lead turned out to be a ghost, a product of faulty and conflicting eyewitness memories at the Ryder rental agency. The investigation concluded that McVeigh had been alone when he rented the truck. However, a third key figure did emerge: Michael Fortier, another friend from their Army days in Fort Riley, Kansas. Fortier was aware of the plot. McVeigh had shown him the plans, had detailed the type of bomb he intended to build, and had even tried to recruit him to help. Fortier, though sympathetic to McVeigh's ideology, was hesitant and ultimately refused to participate directly. But he did nothing to stop it. He didn't call the police. He didn't warn anyone. After the bombing, both Michael and his wife Lori Fortier lied to the FBI about their knowledge of the plot. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, they eventually agreed to cooperate and became the prosecution's star witnesses in exchange for a lighter sentence for Michael and immunity for Lori. With the three main conspirators identified, McVeigh the architect, Nichols the accomplice, and Fortier the silent witness, the narrative of the crime was complete. It was a homegrown plot, conceived and executed by a small cell of disaffected American men who saw themselves as patriots. The final rescue efforts at the Murrah Building site ended on May 4th. The last body was recovered on May 23rd. The final death toll was staggering. 168 people were killed, including 19 children under the age of 6. More than 680 others were injured. It was a wound from which the city and the nation would never fully recover. The legal process that followed was methodical and intense. Due to the sheer scale of the crime and the emotional climate in Oklahoma, it was determined that McVeigh and Nichols could not receive a fair trial there. The cases were moved to Denver, Colorado. The federal government sought the death penalty for both men. The trial of Timothy McVeigh began in the spring of 1997. The prosecution, led by Joseph Hartzler, laid out a mountain of forensic and circumstantial evidence. They traced McVeigh's movements across the country, presented receipts for the bomb-making materials, and used the chilling testimony of Michael and Lori Fortier to detail the plot from its inception to its deadly execution. McVeigh's defense team, led by the brilliant but unconventional Stephen Jones, attempted to create reasonable doubt. They argued that the bombing was the work of a much larger international conspiracy and that McVeigh was merely a pawn, a designated patsy. They floated theories about other potential suspects and tried to poke holes in the government's forensic evidence. But they could not overcome the sheer weight of the evidence against their client, nor could they overcome McVeigh's own apparent lack of remorse. He sat in the courtroom day after day, a cold and detached figure, scribbling notes and showing little emotion, even when the most heart-wrenching testimony was being given by the survivors and the families of the victims. His demeanor was that of a soldier who had completed his mission, not a man on trial for mass murder. On June 2, 1997, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury in Denver found Timothy McVeigh guilty on all 11 counts of murder and conspiracy. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. McVeigh himself remained impassive, his expression unchanged. For the families of the victims who had traveled to Denver for the trial, it was a moment of profound, if somber, vindication. The legal system had affirmed what they already knew. The subsequent penalty phase of the trial was a formality. The jury quickly recommended the death penalty, a decision McVeigh seemed to not only expect but welcome. He saw it as a form of martyrdom, a final, defiant statement against the government he so violently opposed. The trial of Terry Nichols followed a few months later and was a more complex affair. Unlike McVeigh, Nichols had a family and a less overtly aggressive persona, which his defense team used to portray him as a man manipulated and dominated by McVeigh's powerful personality. They argued that while Nichols may have helped gather some materials, he was not a true partner in the plot and had tried to back out before the final act. The prosecution presented evidence that Nichols was deeply involved, having helped mix the explosives and having robbed an Arkansas gun dealer to help finance the operation. The jury ultimately found him guilty of conspiracy and 8 counts of involuntary manslaughter for the deaths of the federal law enforcement officers killed in the blast. But they deadlocked on the murder charges for the civilian victims. This verdict spared him the federal death penalty, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Unsatisfied, the state of Oklahoma later brought its own murder charges against Nichols, and in 2004, he was convicted on 161 counts of first-degree murder, though a state jury also deadlocked on the death penalty, resulting in another sentence of life without parole. Timothy McVeigh, for his part, waived most of his appeals. He was transferred to the newly built federal supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, and then to the federal death row facility in Terre Haute, Indiana. In the years leading up to his execution, he showed no remorse. In letters and interviews, he remained defiant, articulate, and chillingly logical in his own warped worldview. He referred to the children killed in the daycare as collateral damage and famously stated, "I am sorry these people had to lose their lives, but that's the nature of the beast." He sought to control his own narrative until the very end, collaborating on a biography, American Terrorist, in which he laid out his motivations in stark detail, hoping it would serve as an inspiration for others. On June 11, 2001, 6 years after the bombing, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection. He chose as his final written statement the 1875 poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley, a defiant ode to unconquerable will, which ends with the famous lines, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." He faced his death with the same cold, unwavering composure he had displayed throughout his trial. For many of the victims' families who watched the execution on a closed-circuit broadcast in Oklahoma City, his death brought a sense of finality, but not necessarily peace. The hole he had torn in their lives, and in the life of the city, was too vast to be filled by a single act of legal retribution. The legacy of the Oklahoma City bombing is deep and enduring. It fundamentally changed America's understanding of terrorism. The attack shattered the illusion that the nation was only vulnerable to threats from abroad. It revealed a dark, violent undercurrent of anti-government extremism within America's own borders, a movement that had been festering largely unnoticed by the mainstream. The bombing forced law enforcement and the public to confront the reality of domestic terrorism, leading to new laws, increased surveillance of militia groups, and a greater awareness of the potential for radicalization within the country. The physical landscape of the nation was also altered. In the aftermath, a new era of security began for federal buildings across the country. The open, accessible nature of public spaces was replaced by concrete bollards, security checkpoints, and shatterproof glass. The Murrah building itself became a symbol of this new, warier age. The bombing was a brutal lesson in vulnerability, and the architectural response was to harden the nation's infrastructure against its own citizens. But the most powerful legacy resides in Oklahoma City itself. In the place where the Murrah Building once stood, there is now a place of profound and quiet remembrance. The Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum is not just a monument. It is a sacred space. The outdoor memorial features a reflecting pool where the street once ran, and a field of 168 empty chairs, one for each victim, arranged in 9 rows to represent the 9 floors of the building. The chairs are of 2 sizes, large ones for the adults and small ones for the children. Their silent, empty forms a heartbreaking testament to the lives cut short. A survivor tree, an American elm that miraculously withstood the blast, stands as a living symbol of the city's resilience. The bombing did not spark the Second American Revolution that McVeigh had envisioned. It did the opposite. It revealed a deep well of compassion, unity, and strength in the American spirit. The response from across the country, and the quiet dignity and resilience of the people of Oklahoma, became known as the Oklahoma Standard. It was a standard of service, honor, and kindness, a powerful rebuke to the hatred that had motivated the attack. The story of the Oklahoma City bombing is ultimately not just a story of domestic terror and extremist ideology. It is a story of immense loss, of unimaginable grief, and of the enduring power of a community to respond to the worst of humanity with the very best of it, choosing remembrance over revenge and unity over the division that the bombers sought to create.